Okay. Hey, everybody. Welcome to part 3 of chapter 18. Wow, that intro music sure was soothing. Running a professional operation here, don't you say? Don't you think? Okay, well, moving on. We are wrapping up Evolution from the Textbook, part 3 of 3. So far, we've looked at the history of life according to the fossil record. We started with small, boring stuff and worked our way up to weird stuff, to dinosaurs, birds, whales, but we left off humans. So this PowerPoint, this video actually, is about human evolution. All right, so humans are classified as primates. What are primates? Primates are mammals, placental mammals, and this would include orangutans, monkeys, chimpanzees, and you and I. Primates have a lot of similarities to humans, so they're pretty similar as far as their DNA, their biochemistry, their physiology, in some ways their behavior, although humans are the most complex behavior-wise. We'll talk about that later, but still we share a lot of things in common with the primates. Right? And so over the last couple million years, the primates have been diversifying into lots of different species, many of which have gone extinct, and we only know about them from the fossil record. And it's thought that around 7 million years ago, maybe as recent as 5 million years ago, a lineage of primates evolved into some human-like species that are ancestors of humans, and these are called hominins. And the hominins are grouped together because they're bipedal. We'll use that term a lot in this lecture. Bipedal means they walk around on two legs, walk around upright. So most of your monkeys are going to swing from the trees. They've got long arms and short, stumpy legs. Some, like gorillas, are knuckle walkers, so they walk on all fours when they're on the ground. But humans are fairly unique in that we walk around on two legs. Humans are also unique in that we have culture and art and music and complex language. So there's a lot of things that set humans apart, even though we have a lot of similarities with the other primates. Here is a family tree of the primates, so you can get a visual of some of the species I mentioned just a minute ago. Remember kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. This is order primates within class Mammalia. And you can see that in our order, we have lemurs, tarsiers, New World monkeys, basically monkeys in South America, Old World monkeys, monkeys in Africa and Asia, gibbons, orangutans, gorillas, chimps, and then the species that are in the human family tree, including humans. So there's a couple terms that get thrown around that just really briefly, I won't test you on what I'm about to say. Just know that from here down is family Hominidae, so class Mammalia, order primates, family Hominidae. So orangutans, gorillas, and chimps, out of all these, are considered our closest relatives, and they're all hominids. And then hominins, which we'll spend a lot of time talking about in a few minutes, hominins are you and I, humans, and then also all of the ancestors, or at least the species that are in the human lineage that were bipedal, walking around on two legs. Sometimes in popular culture you'll see this graphic, so this is pretty famous. There's lots of iterations of this, I'm sure you're familiar. But I wanted to talk about it for a minute because it gives the impression that there's kind of this linear evolution. There's this chimpanzee-like ape, and over time it gets taller and its brain gets bigger, and eventually it becomes a human. And it turns out that in reality, based on the fossil record, it looks something more like this, more like a branching tree. So you can see that there was a common ancestor that existed, I don't know, around 5 to 7 million years ago. And its descendants split off. Some of them split off and became modern day chimpanzees. So chimpanzees are our closest relative in the animal kingdom. And then in the hominin line, or the human line, we get all sorts of different species. We'll be talking about some of these, but you can see there's branches that give rise to a different genus called Paranthropus. There's a branch that gives rise to another genus called Australopithecus, and then eventually there's a branch that gives rise to our genus, genus Homo, And there's several species of Homo. They're not all included in this picture, but Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Homo neanderthaliensis, which we'll talk about all three of those in just a minute. And then here we are, Homo sapiens. And look, it kind of looks like me. Whoa. This is from your textbook. This is showing the human family tree again. And now this one's not quite as fancy because it just has skulls represented, but it gives you a good idea of more of some of the complexity that we see in these primate fossils that are thought to be closely related to humans. So again, they first show up, these bipedal upright walking apes show up around 5 to 7 million years ago, a couple different species represented. And then here's your main two groups, which I'd mentioned in the previous slide, the Australopithecines and the Paranthropus species. And then there's genus Homo. So there's a lot of data, there's a lot of disagreement over how some of these fit. You can tell, and how they're related, you can tell by the question marks that are found. Some of these are known from a single skull, sometimes a skull with a jaw, sometimes with not, sometimes other body parts. So the fossil record is kind of a mix of different resolutions. But the point is, it's a fairly complex family tree, and again, with these early kind of weird primate, upright walking primates, the Australopithecines, Paranthropus, and then our genus Homo. So the story is that around 5 to 7 million years ago, some primates came out of the trees. So most of the other primates that you saw a few slides ago are still in the trees. So orangutans and tarsiers and New World and Old World monkeys, they jump around from tree branch to tree branch. Their feet aren't really feet, but almost like a second pair of hands. Their thumb or their big toe, if we're talking hind legs, sticks out to the side so they can grasp branches. But it's thought that 5 to 7 million years ago, some lineages came out of the trees and started to spend more time on the ground. So they lived in the plains or the open savannas. This is occurring in Africa. And over time, some of these lineages started to use tools and gained some pretty complex skills. And also, they became more intelligent, and over time, eventually began to establish cultures and perform domestication or agriculture. And so as the brain size increased, what you're going to see is a trend where the bodies became smaller and weaker. In other words, instead of investing resources in having big jaws and big teeth and big muscles and being strong, we get species that become progressively weaker physically, but smarter or more intelligent mentally. So it's a trade-off. Instead of using the calories to make big bodies, some of these species start using the calories to make big brains. You'll also see, and we'll see more of this in just a second, but you'll see that in the skulls of many of these different species, that over time the hole in the skull where the spinal cord plugs in moves, and it moves in order to allow more efficient upright walking, right? And so as they become better and better walkers on two legs, there are some anatomical structures that respond and make that process more efficient. And then eventually, around 200,000 years ago, at least, maybe as many as 350,000 years ago, our species first shows up in the fossil record. So our species, again, is Homo sapiens. So every human alive today is a Homo sapien, including you and I. And they first show up in Africa, in northern Africa, and then over time left Africa and dispersed throughout Asia and into Europe and Australia, and then eventually to the Americas. So I mentioned the hole in the skull. In this picture, there are 4 species represented. So on the left, you're looking at the bottom side of the skull of a chimpanzee, and here's a chimpanzee pelvis. This is Australopithecus africanus. Here's its skull, here's its pelvis. This is Homo erectus. And then over here is us. This is Homo sapiens. So let's talk about the skulls first. So I mentioned that as these species began to spend more and more time upright on two legs, their where their spinal cord plugs into the brain started to shift. So if you look at a chimpanzee, which doesn't spend very much time on its walking around on its hind legs, this hole is where the spinal cord comes up from the spinal column from the back and plugs into the base of the brain. And you can see it's kind of towards the back of the skull. If we were to look at a dog skull or a tiger skull or a deer skull, any other mammal that doesn't spend very much time upright but rather walking around on all legs, this hole on all four legs, this hole is even further back. So you think about your dog's skull, the spinal cord is going to plug into the back of it, right? And so that hole needs to be more towards the back of the skull rather than the bottom. When we look at Australopithecus africanus, the hole has shifted upwards. So this is a hint that perhaps it's spending more time upright. With Homo erectus, as we get closer to the human line, we see that this hole is even more central. And then with humans, it's the most central of all. So the hole in your skull is at the bottom, and that allows the spinal cord to plug in very nicely. When we look at the pelvises, you can see that they get wider over time. So the chimp pelvis is pretty narrow. So again, just to get you oriented, this is the hips, and then this is where the legs plug in. So the femur of the chimp would plug in here and here. And so the chimp pelvis is pretty narrow. The Australopithecus pelvis is a little bit wider. And then as we progress to humans have a really wide pelvis, especially female humans typically. And so why is this? Well, two reasons. One, having a wider pelvis allows us to be more stable. It kind of spreads out our center of gravity and helps us walk upright. So again, as the species spend more time walking upright, then the pelvis widens. A wide pelvis is also awesome when you're giving birth to big skulled babies. So a human baby is a freakishly large skull attached to a freakishly small body. And so during childbirth, that ginormous skull has to go through the opening at the base of the pelvis down here. So ladies, yeah, good luck with that. So a wider pelvis allowed us to not only walk more efficiently, but allows us to give birth to larger skulled babies. Why do we care about how big the skull of a baby is? Well, the larger the skull, then the more room is available for a brain. And so what we see is that chimpanzees have small brains, Australopithecines is a little bit larger, Homo erectus is a little bit larger, and then Homo sapiens brains, and therefore also their skulls, are ridiculously large. Here's another side-by-side comparison of ape and hominin skulls. So we've got a gorilla, Australopithecus, Homo erectus, Neanderthal, and then here are humans, Homo sapiens. So if you just look at the brain case, the part of the skull that holds the brain, it gets larger and larger. So in a gorilla, it's relatively small. In fact, the bulk of their skull is their face, and they've got these huge jaw muscles and huge jaw bones, which are attached to huge jaw muscles, and huge teeth. Australopithecines display a lot of similarities with a gorilla skull, but the brain case is starting to get a little bit more round. In Homo erectus, it's a little bit more football shaped, so it's extending backwards. Neanderthals had big brains and therefore big skulls, and then again, the human brain case, look, it even drops way down here, and so it allows us to have a really big skull and brain. To give you a sense of brain sizes, if you weigh a human brain, it's going to weigh around 1,350 grams. A chimp is 400, and a macaw is a teeny little brain guy, about 100 grams. So again, humans have big brains, especially compared to modern apes, but also compared to the other ape species that we see in the fossil record. You don't have to memorize this. This is just begging the question, or I included this on here to ask the question, what does it mean to be human? So in this column, we see a list of different hominids, different primates that are represented in the fossil record, and it's just a bunch of gibberish to you. That's fine. oftentimes in science, when you read a research paper about a new human that's discovered, what they're talking about is members of genus Homo. So we're Homo sapiens down here, and these are all other species of genus Homo, all with a different species name. So in science, sometimes we'll say anybody that's a member of genus Homo is human. So that can be efficient in some ways, but it's also kind of insufficient because it depends on what we mean by human. So if we're just talking about anatomy, then everybody in genus Homo has a lot of similarities, similar bone structure, similar size, probably some similar behaviors as well. But in a Homo habilis and some of these other uh, members of genus Homo, they don't really act a whole lot like humans. So none of these are going to be undergoing or performing art or culture. They're not going to be writing books. We don't know if they could talk or not, but they probably weren't reciting poetry or singing songs. So Homo sapiens, you and I, we're members of genus Homo, and depending on your definition of human, we're not really sure if who else is human. I don't know if that made any sense. So what does make us human then? Well, we do have one unique anatomical characteristic, and you can see that in this picture, and it's the chin. Right? So if you reach down and grab your chin, you can kind of feel at the base of your lower front teeth that the bone of your lower jaw kind of sticks forward, and that gives you a chin. And maybe you've got a small chin or you've got a Jay Leno sized chin, whatever. It doesn't matter. The point is you have a chin, and Homo sapiens are the only species that have a chin. So one answer, there's many answers to the question, what does it mean to be human? One answer is humans have a chin. All right, so that was a lot of different species names that we saw over the last couple slides. So let's zoom in and get to know a few of them in a little bit more detail. So we're gonna here's skulls represented for four of the species that five of the species we're gonna talk about. So Australopithecus afarensis, which is about 4 million years old. Australopithecus africanus, which is around 3 million years old. Homo habilis, 2.3 million years old. Homo erectus, 1.8 million years old. And then Neanderthals, about 500,000 years old, at least. We're going to talk about each of them in turn. This is where they show up on the fossil record. So again, the last two videos we kind of began with we began with complex animal life. We saw those weird critters in the Cambrian and the Cambrian explosion. And then we saw jawed fish and amphibians and reptiles and dinosaurs and birds and weird mammals and normal mammals, including whales. So all of these different primates and hominin species are showing up in the last 4 million years. All right, and these pictures show artist reconstructions of each of these species. So on the previous slide, you saw the skulls. And what they did was they gave the skulls to a forensic modeler. So like if someone gets murdered, right, and you dig up the skull and you want to know what they look like, so maybe you could match it up with a missing persons report, you can get someone who knows a lot about human facial anatomy, and they can look at the bones and kind of try to figure out what that person looked like. And so they did the same thing with these primate skull or with these hominin skulls. And so these are a particular artist's best rendition of what they look like. So here's Australopithecus afarensis, Australopithecus africanus, and so on and so forth. And I used Einstein as a representative Homo sapien. Seems like a good choice. All right, so let's look at each of these in a little bit more detail. So first up is Australopithecus afarensis. So again, this is pretty early in the human lineage, 4 million years. So I don't know, 1 to 3 million years after the split in the lineage that separated these hominins from chimpanzees' ancestors. So again, this thing was walking around on 2 legs. All right, so it was bipedal. And that's thought to be true based on foot bones and leg bones, basically anatomical clues. Its brain is 468 cc's. Earlier I was talking about brain size in terms of grams. A cc is simply a cubic centimeter, and it's just another way of measuring brain volume. So as you'll see, that's a pretty small brain compared to the other ones that we're about to talk about. And then also, this thing was definitely an ape. In other words, it didn't wear clothes, it didn't have music, it never, as far as we know, it didn't make tools. They probably just slept in the trees and came down and fed on the ground, probably ate fruit, um, and uh, and definitely not a lot of human characteristics. They didn't bury their dead, and probably couldn't talk, use words, didn't have language, etc. Australopithecus africanus is a little bit later, and so this is about a million years younger or later than Afarensis, and its brain, as you can see, averages a little bit bigger. It's also bipedal, and again doesn't have any of the characteristics that I mentioned just a minute ago. So it doesn't have language, doesn't have tools, wasn't burying its dead. So again, for all intents and purposes, even though it's a bipedal ape, it doesn't have a ton in common with Homo sapiens based on behavior and culture. And then we get to our first representative of genus Homo. This is Homo habilis, sometimes called the tool man. And so a little bit younger, around 2 million years old, about the same size. The brain is bigger, so we can infer that it was probably more intelligent than the Australopithecines we just saw. Again, it's bipedal. And there are some stone tools that we think were probably made by Homo habilis. And so these stone tools were made by them cracking rocks together and basically making scrapers and cutters, stone tools that they could use to presumably crack a nut or harvest a dead animal carcass, right? Maybe scrape skin and muscle off and make a hide. We don't know that they were making clothes. They probably weren't. They're probably using the tools to process food. All right, and then there's Homo erectus. So much younger. In fact, was still around 300,000 years ago. It's also taller and more slender. So up until this point, like with the Australopithecines, again, kind of a ape-like body form, but Homo erectus was tall and thin. And in Africa, it probably lived on the hot plains, and being tall and thin helped it radiate heat a little bit better. The brain is larger than Homo habilis, so again, probably more intelligent. It's bipedal, otherwise we wouldn't be talking about it. And they made stone tools, but their stone tools are more advanced than habilis. So just better engineered scrapers and choppers and cutters. They may have used fire, and this is important because once a species can manipulate fire, you can use it to cook, you can use it to burn down brush and improve your hunting odds. So fire is kind of like a tool that we only find in the human lineage. And again, it's thought that Homo erectus used fire. So of the species we've talked about so far, Homo erectus was probably the only one that roasted a rabbit over a campfire in a cave, staying out of the rain. I don't know. All right, Neanderthals. Homo neanderthaliensis. And so I'm just going to call them Neanderthals. It's easier to say. So this is, it may have been a descendant of Homo erectus, not really sure, but it shows up primarily in Europe about 500,000 years ago, and it was around at the same time as erectus. You can see it overlapped, so it went extinct around 300,000 years ago. Their body, instead of being tall and thin like erectus, Neanderthals were a little bit shorter and stubbier, so kind of more stocky. And I mentioned they lived in Europe. In Europe at this time, towards the tail end of the Neanderthal lifespan or time frame, was fairly cold. And so it's thought that being shorter and stockier helped them retain heat a little bit better. They had pretty big brains, really big brains, so they were probably intelligent. The debate is still going on about if they could communicate and use language and how much speech they were capable of. But definitely big brains. Their tools are more advanced, so we've got cutters and scrapers and choppers, but they also have spears. So they were able to make a sharp point and then attach it to a long stick and probably help utilize that in hunting. Neanderthals could definitely manipulate fire, and so they would definitely cook food over a fire, use a fire for warmth. It does seem that they would stay in caves. So a cave in the winter is pretty warm, and a cave in the summer is pretty cool. So a cave is it's damp and dark, but if you've got a fire, you can make a cave a home. Neanderthals buried their dead, right? And so we're not sure if they gave them funeral rites before they buried them, but burying the dead is a human characteristic. We still do it today. And maybe Neanderthals were doing it because they didn't want the bodies to smell bad, but it could also be that they felt sad and they to some degree revered their dead. They may have worn jewelry and clothes, although their clothes were probably animal hide, and some of them interbred with humans. We know that because we know the DNA or the genomes of Neanderthals. Scientists were able to extract some DNA from bones, and they've got big sections of DNA that a lot of humans, especially humans of European descent, have. So because of that, some scientists will even place Neanderthals as a subspecies alongside Homo sapiens. So in other words, they're considered pretty closely related. And then Homo sapiens, again, showed up 200 to maybe 350,000 years ago, initially in the Middle East and Africa, northern Africa. And so on average, about 6 feet tall, not quite as tall and thin on average as Homo erectus, but a little thinner and less stocky than Neanderthals. Brains are really big. We've got good brains. We have fine brains. Humans can manipulate fire and sophisticated tools. I put a machine gun on here just to be funny, but initially the tools that they were using were stone and wood and bone, and so the toolkit of early Homo sapiens was even more advanced than Neanderthals. And so Homo sapiens were making knives out of stone and bone. They were making spears. They were making bows and arrows. They were making sewing needles out of bone. They were wearing clothes of animal hide initially, and later on cotton. Homo sapiens display pretty complex culture, so this doesn't show up right away, but beginning around, I don't know, 40 to 70,000 years ago, they started making art, carving figurines out of bone. We have flutes made out of weird things like a vulture bone flute that was found in a cave. I think it was about, don't quote me on this, but about 40,000 years old. Buried their dead, and sometimes, especially later on, buried their dead with a lot of symbolism. So instead of just throwing the body into a grave, they would position the body and maybe bury the body with clothes or with another human, and bury it with weapons and jars of food, and really weird scenarios where they buried a female sitting up tied to a post holding deer antlers. Pretty creepy. But lots of symbolism. Religion shows up later. Domestication of animals and plants. So agriculture is unique to Homo sapiens. Use of imagination is possible because of the big brain. So imagine Harry Potter. Did you do it? Okay, cool. So that's actually pretty hard to do. We all probably have the same image of Harry Potter. And that imagination is only possible with a complex brain. So Homo sapiens aren't that distinct anatomically, but we're fairly distinct in our behavior and our culture and our language. And those things are due to our big brain. So if you put these species side by side, you can see some transitions. So over the span of time of about 3 to 4 million years, they're all bipedal, walk around on two legs, and then with genus Homo, you get the first primitive stone tools, and then fire comes on the scene, and then Homo sapiens with all the cool stuff that humans do. So there's different competing hypotheses about where Homo sapiens originated, but the leading one, probably the most common one, is the out of Africa hypothesis. This is the idea that Homo sapiens first showed up in Africa and then moved out from there. So they leave Africa maybe 60 to 70,000 years ago, move into the Middle East and the Fertile Crescent, and then some population groups spread to Europe and Asia, Australia by 50,000 years ago, and then they were able to cross the Bering Land Bridge or the Bering Strait in Alaska about 16,000 years ago or so, and then migrated throughout the Americas. So by about 12,000 years ago at the latest, we've got Homo sapiens on every continent but Antarctica. And so these different populations of humans developed their own cultures and their own religions and their own types of tools and their own hunting and agricultural techniques, as well as their own languages and mythologies. So overall, I'm just hitting the highlights, but overall, this slide is intended just um, to give you an overview of evolution. So again, everything kicks off at the beginning of the Paleozoic with weird stuff, and then fish and amphibians and reptiles, and then by the time we hit the Mesozoic, it's all these different reptiles and dinosaurs and eventually birds. The Cenozoic is all these different mammals and ice ages, and then in the last 7 million years, bipedal primates, and in the last 200,000 years or so, Homo sapiens. So of this half billion year long evolution of complex animals, you can see that primates and humans show up at the very end. So we're a fairly young or recent species. Okay, that wraps up our evolution unit. So hopefully you've got a good idea of the history of evolutionary ideas, of the mechanisms that drive evolution to create new species. You have a good idea of fossils and where they come from, and how we can use fossils and rock layers to age and track the history of the Earth, as well as the history of animals and plants and other organisms throughout Earth's history according to the fossil record. Okay, so next up we'll be talking about different Christian views of evolution and do a survey of competing models. See you next time. Like and subscribe. And I was gonna hold on. Oh, wait for it. Wait for it. Later, guys.